All right, we should be live now. Hello, everyone. It's another episode of Dev Impressions. My name's Chris. I'm your host, and today I'm joined by my great friend Chet Husk. Hey, Chet. It's great to have you here.
Hey, funny seeing you this morning
Yeah,
slash afternoon your time.
yeah. Well, it's
What a
still,
crazy random happenstance.
dude. Yeah, I know. It's still early out there, right?
Yep, it is the
Yeah.
crack of 9 a.m. and
Oh
everybody
my
is
God,
getting up and getting ready to go to work.
dude. Usually that's like middle of the night. For me, I wake up at 11 or some stuff like that, usually.
Yeah, I have two dogs though that prevent
Oh,
me from sleeping in that way. So 7:15, 7:30, the pawing starts.
yeah. All right, so what should we talk about? I guess we should talk about tabletop RPGs, right? That's the
Yeah, we
topic
should
of.
just dive right into that. I'm ready to go anytime on that topic.
So actually, I never asked you, what's your favorite system right now?
Oh man, so if we have to go by like hours played, it has to be Pathfinder First Edition. I've been playing that pretty consistently for I think 8 years now. Um, I've got a group that meets once a week, and there are six of us. And over those 9 years, we've gone through eight different campaigns, I think. And we just, we round robin. Whenever
Yep.
somebody wants to run an adventure, they run it until they get tired, and then we start interleaving the two different adventures and then tail off.
Yep,
It's worked really great.
that's pretty awesome. And that's a long-standing group.
It is. And actually, there are takeaways there for open source software maintainers and about sustainability, right? So
Throw it at me.
when you have a core group of people that are all invested and all read up on how to do all of the things in your project, then people can sort of take a step back when they need it and then come back when they need it. So you got to
So
foster that core group.
So basically, what you're telling me is that everyone doing software development should also play TTRPGs. So
100%. Absolutely, yes. Uh, and like just PSA, public service announcement to anyone out there, if you haven't, they're not all super dice rolly and crunchy and battle all the time like Pathfinder. Recently, over the pandemic, I've gotten into playing. Actually, you can see it up on the thing over there. Blades in the Dark. There we go. Which is a very like it's a much more narrative tabletop RPG,
yep.
and it's sort of in the vein of like GURPS, where the emphasis is more on the story that you and the rest of the players sort of weave together. So there's something for everybody out there.
And what was the other one that we've played? Fuck.
Dungeon World,
Yeah, exactly. That's also
that's even more so.
it's even more so. It's still fantasy. The Blades in the Dark is a bit interesting setting. It's kind of like not for everyone, I guess. But Dungeon
Very
World,
very grimy, yeah.
yeah, Dungeon World is your typical heroic fantasy style of thingy. Well, you can play any kind of fantasy with it, I guess. But if you're into something like positive and not necessarily killing people and
Seedy
more,
criminal underbelly.
yeah, man. All right, let's actually move to I guess to the F sharp because that's why we are here. So how actually have you started with F sharp? I kind of like don't really
Oh boy.
remember, or I don't even know if I was around.
Well, I sort of came to F sharp from a automation and tooling perspective of like builds. So I worked at a company called Volusion several years back, and we had a microservices architecture, and it was a lot to wrangle. And I was one of the people that was sort of in charge of, or for my components, getting everything we expect now for microservices, like tagged, stamped builds, automated tests, coverage, deployment, all of these things. And so I spent a lot of my time there, and we had these horrific scripts and a whole bunch of like old Team Foundation version control build system stuff that was very hairy and hard to detangle. And while I was looking for solutions, I came across Fake because like it was one of the things that had been in that build space for a while, and I took a stab on it, and it worked fairly well. And that was my first intro to F# overall. We eventually, spread it to all the different projects we had for building, and then started building like little testing tools with it too, like using scripts interactively. At the same time, there was one single component of that system that had been written in F#, and because of my interest and experience, I sort of took that over from a previous developer and discovered, like, that's when I got the bug for it. And that was even like back before we had such nice web programming libraries like Giraffe and that whole ecosystem.
Yeah.
So even back in the old ASP.NET Web API world, it was still good and fun and useful to work with. So from there, it just sort of graduated. At every position I've taken since then, I've either built from scratch with F# or incorporated F# into the product to strengthen it and make it more resilient and also more personally satisfying for me to work on.
Yeah,
So
I know the feeling.
and that's graduated now all the way up to my current position at Binary Defense, where our entire like back-end server infrastructure is F# end to end. So it's been a nice progression, and it's been very pleasant for me personally working in a full stack F# environment to be productive and to have that level of safety and confidence all the way through.
Yeah, that's kind of like, I guess, maybe not common story, but story that kind of like you hear from time to time, that people were first started with fake and maybe some tests, and then kind of like moved from that point like deeper and deeper into the ecosystem. And that story that you hear both on the how you adapt the language in the company, but also how like the individual developers adapt F#. So that's great. Yeah, and back in the old days, that was adapting F# back then was a bit more difficult than right now. Right now, everything is so cool in comparison
It's
to.
so nice these days. Yeah. Well, and the best part is like the tools that I started with back then that were useful to me still are. So like irrespective of the build task stuff, the next pieces of F# that I learned and incorporated were fparsec and property-based testing with fscheck, and those are still like in my tool belt and like critically useful to this day. So I mean that's like 8+ years of good work out of those, and the only thing that's changed has been like how I actually get them from NuGet or whatever, So that's a pretty awesome story. Like for me personally, like I hadn't consciously thought about how consistent some of these core tools have been. So
yeah, I think F# is in pretty decent spot that it has those like long-standing projects that are really, really stable and like everyone knows how to use them. And also at the same time, we are not afraid, as a community in general, we are not afraid to experiment with new stuff and come up with the new ideas, because there are some other communities that have a long-standing project and they just have long-standing projects. So, which is also not the great. Like, I mean, you need to find the balance. Like, obviously, creating a new framework every 2 weeks is not the greatest idea, but at the same time, not changing the way you build UI for 20 years is also not maybe the greatest idea.
Fair enough. Yeah, I do think that is one of the strengths of the F# community. We have a segment of our community that is pushing F# into places that it historically has not been. And I'm referring to Fable here. And even just over the past month, seeing some of the crazy things that have come down has been like personally invigorating for me. So we already know Fable is a first-class JavaScript transpiler, but just in the past couple weeks/months, we've seen PHP come in through Jeremy's work, and we've seen Python coming in through Dag's work. And I even hear rumors now on the horizon about Dart and/or Flutter. So like that's awesome to me. Like that's sort of the core Like I love seeing individual implementations of that core AST to whatever target you want model. And it's just really tickling me personally to think of like writing F# and running it on like a container framework or a cloud providers framework that only accepts Python or something, like Google Cloud did a few years back. Right. So
totally.
I love that idea.
I mean, one of my best experiences I had in the last couple of years, I guess, is for a while I've experimented with building my own product using the Cloudflare workers, and Cloudflare workers is only using JavaScript, right? It's JavaScript only platform. So using Fable for that was like super fun. I mean, in the end, I haven't went with the product because reasons not related to technology, but yeah, whole experience was super fun. So I love that. Also, for like this like different compilation from like one language to another. In the end, ML languages has always been in its core designed to be really good compiler languages. Initially, like 50 years ago, when the first ML has happened, that was kind of like one of the goals.
It's so yes, 100% yes, but like shifting the focus a little bit from that academic historical perspective, it's also like having something like Fable and seeing the output that it has for the different targets has been educational for me these days, right? Because part of the activity of creating a new backend for Fable is not just doing the actual code translation, but doing representation of F# semantics in that target language as well. And so one thing that's pretty interesting to me is seeing how those semantics would be represented in those languages. And what I like to do is do sort of a compare and contrast between what the idiomatic thing is for that language and what Fable wants to do to maintain F# semantics, and then ask myself, well, what am I losing if I do the idiomatic way for that language, right? Like, what are the pitfalls there?
Yeah.
So it's a nice, I like comparing things in that way.
So I guess in the same venue of like abstract syntax tree and long-standing projects, you've been also recently for the last couple of years, really involved with the FS Autocomplete and F# compiler services and all that. So how have you ended up like being interested in tooling? That's not the most obvious path for developers. I mean, only some of us find pleasure in fixing all those weird bugs and the complex stuff.
So yeah, I'm broken, and that's why. B, it was actually partly you, right? So when I started F#, I was in a heavy Windows world, and Visual Studio rules the roost there. I wasn't yet a like paying JetBrains subscription user either, so I wasn't well up to date on what they wanted. And so when you first came on the scene, when Atom came out and made the FunScript transpiled F# support, that was something interesting to me. That was, hey, now that I'm working on OS X stuff for the startup I was at the time, I still want to use, or I want to learn F#, so Atom is the place to be. And so I started poking around with it at that level. And then when you switched over to VS Code, I just sort of followed along and started improving my personal developer experience in that project. And I don't know if you remember, but initially a lot of my contributions were just at the INI layer, like the sort of presentation layer. And over time, as I discovered, well, I need this piece of information to make this pretty UI widget, that sort of necessitated that I make my way into FS Autocomplete and learn how everything works. And now I think I have developed that understanding reasonably well.
Yeah, definitely.
To the point that fun for me sounds like munging MSBuild on a weekend to try and figure out why .NET 6 is completely destroying us.
Well, because every major version of .NET is completely destroying us. So that's nothing new, man.
Well, I mean, like so many things, the problem comes down to MSBuild and or finding your dependency references.
Oh yeah, that's the
Same exact problem here.
yeah. It's kind of like, so that's actually a funny point. Like I think people don't understand why we complain about MSBuild so much, because like you cannot, if you're just like you're a standard user and just write applications using templates that are provided by Microsoft or by community, whatever. You usually just add files to the MSBuild, add maybe project references, add NuGet packages, and then that works fine most of the time. Obviously, there are some issues with all that, but then there is like whole different side of the things with MSBuild, which is the tooling integration, and that's ridiculously broken thing.
Yeah. So I will say I do think we're in a much better position these days. Back, like 3-4 years ago, back when .NET Core was first starting to get started, folks may not know this, but the F# compiler itself bundled logic for how to find dependencies. And this was back in the days when we still had the GAC, the Global Assemblies Cache. And so from the perspective of the compiler, there was a set of references like system.io, etc., that the compiler would implicitly add for you. And then it would do all of the path probing and all of the location finding. And if that ever got out of sync with what MSBuild was doing when you actually built the project, then you would get these weird little Heisenberg errors. Thankfully, to this day, everything has been unified. So now all of the dependency resolution stuff happens in the MSBuild targets, and the compiler just gets a flat list of here are all the DLLs that we need to reference to build. So it's a lot cleaner now, at the cost of now you have to do an MSBuild project evaluation to get those dependencies, which then you have to decide, am I going to run MSBuild in process, or am I going to shell out to it? And if I shell out to it, how do I extract the information correctly? Like, you trade off a set of problems, and there's like a whole ecosystem of libraries around doing this right. We've got ProjInfo on our side that a lot of the F# community uses. Dave Glick has got Buildalizer, and there's like a whole mini ecosystem around doing this correctly because it's so fraught.
I mean, even for our stuff, I think it's like current version of Project Info is like third big rewrite of Project Info, and then before that there used to be the Project Cracker that was part of the compiler service. For a while we used both in the parallel, so that was ridiculous. Like we had this like matrix of like what happens when FS Autocomplete runs on the .NET Core versus full framework, and then what type of the project file user was using, the old verbose one versus the new fancy one. So that was like ridiculous. Like I'm so happy that we've get rid of that in the Ionite 5.
In so many ways, from a tooling perspective, things are so much simpler and so much easier. I think the big thing we struggle with now on the open source, or I guess the free editors, is that even accurate? I know VS Community has a free version.
Yeah,
anyway,
community version, whatever.
I will say the FS Autocomplete derived editors is that we don't have like a full battle hardened project or a project system the way that Writer and Visual Studio proper do. And so a lot of the corner cases that people see, or a lot of the issues people run into, will be because a project hasn't invalidated correctly and it needs to be rebuilt, or cross-project references are broken in this version of FCS, or or anything like that. So, and I mean, that's also tied into supporting multiple configurations or multiple target frameworks within a single editor experience too, right? So that's where all the hard work is. Everything else, like everything we do, if you look inside any of the FS Autocomplete code, we just pass stuff into the compiler and we need a set of project options, and the project options are where all of that complexity goes. So
totally. And it's kind of like also So I don't want to complain too much, but obviously, like people, I think most of the users just doesn't realize how much work is that because it's fairly invisible. If it works fine, and you kind of like don't notice that like months of work has been put into improving project parsing, and then when it doesn't work, people compare Ionite to the Visual Studio or to Rider, and they're oh, it works in Rider or in VS or in VS for Mac, forgetting that those editors have like whole teams working only on project system. Like it's ridiculously complex thing that requires so much expertise, and we don't have this expertise. Like I mean, we know something about this stuff, but obviously not as much as folks at Microsoft that has been doing that for 20 years.
If like Satya Nadella came to me tomorrow and he said, "What could I do to improve the experience of .NET developers as a whole on non-Visual Studio platforms?" I would say, give us open source the project system.
Well,
not just open source it, but make it embeddable.
Yeah, project
or
system
shareable.
Project system is open source, like at least huge parts of that. It's just not usable outside of Visual Studio. I've tried that. Like, trust me, I've tried that.
I completely agree, and to some extent, they're getting better there. So there's this concept of Roslyn workspaces that does support that to some degree, from my understanding. And there's a technical gap on the F# side that we don't integrate with Roslyn workspaces, right? And that's sort of a common or recurring theme too, right? Like analyzers are based on Roslyn syntax trees. Guess what? The F# compiler doesn't do.
We have better analyzers, man.
I know. But it's the same core thing, right? Like you have these core potentially shareable concepts that are, marooned on one editor right now that can't be shared. So all you watching out there, agitate towards MS to make a pluggable project system. We will love you forever if you do.
Dude, that would be so fun. Like there's also another thing like similar to that would be separating the .NET debugger from the OmniSharp and actually allowing it to be usable outside of VS Code. That would be another awesome thingy. The dependency on OmniSharp is annoying sometimes, especially that you cannot use that dependency on Gitpod or in like NeoVim alternative platforms.
Yeah,
because reasons.
Because licensing.
Yeah, licensing to it. Licensing is the best thing in the world.
Yeah, well, I mean, even in that regard, the debug protocol is an open source protocol for at least for VS Code. For those who may not know, there's a protocol for language servers that allows for pluggable support. There's a one for debuggers as well called the Debug Adapter Protocol, or DAP. And the OmniSharp debugger implements this. And Samsung, of all people, who is a large .NET Core contributor, like they contributed support for their Tizen platform, they've also made a debug adapter protocol compatible .NET Core debugger. And that's actually what Ionide uses for its open distribution version. So for those who don't know, there's the VS Code marketplace, but then there's also an open marketplace. And Ionide publishes to both of those. And when you publish to the open marketplace, we use the Samsung debug adapter specifically to not intrude on licensing.
Yep, and also the fact that there exist two marketplaces is also related to licensing. Unfortunately, any other editor that is using VS Code APIs just cannot use VS Code Marketplace because licensing. So editors like Gitpod, or it's like FIA, editor is named FIA under the hood, or NeoVim, I believe, are both using VS Code compatible APIs. However, they cannot use the marketplace. The same is true about actually open source edition of Visual Studio Code. So if you build Visual Studio Code from the source, you won't be able to use that. And VS Codium, there is this thingy that's kind of like clone of Visual Studio Code because people hate Microsoft or something.
Yeah, it's just debadged.
Yeah.
It's stripped of all the Microsoft branding and that sort of thing.
And it makes Copilot it makes Copilot broken. So
it does.
Yeah, dude.
Oh,
so in Copilot we're using a whole bunch of experimental APIs. So we need to do some custom startup arguments to get it working on the VS Codium or on Code open source edition, which is interesting. And obviously it probably won't work on Gitpod because those APIs are still not implemented in FIA. Yeah, that's tooling. That's tooling, man.
It is legitimately fun though. Like the thing that I appreciate about working in tooling is that if I have a pain point, I feel empowered to go fix it. Case in point, I'm about to butcher his name, but Khalid Boukame, I think, is JetBrains DevRel guy on Twitter. And yesterday he started a discussion thread about like he's spending this week all in F#. Completely admirable. We hooked him up with learning resources, etc. I say we, I mean the Twitter F# mob. And a little bit later, he started a discussion thread about how the code he was using at the time, the F# libraries, didn't seem to have much in the way of documentation on them. And somewhere down the line, I mentioned that if he was using Ionide, then we would generate the documentation header for him, you know, the structure, the summary tags, the parameter tags with their names all filled in and everything. And that got me started thinking about like, what can we do to make that experience slightly better? And immediately what I jumped to, like I went to go look at the language server protocol spec. And right now, when a user says generate documentation, we, from a technical perspective, we issue what's called an insert text edit. And it's just a block of text. Like we inspect the thing that you asked us to generate documentation for.
Okay, I see where it's going.
Okay, so it's just a block of text, but the language server protocol also allows you to return a snippet instead. And in that snippet, you could put, they call them tab stops or placeholders, but they're just little chunks of, or little places where the cursor can be automatically moved between that you can go between with a tab key. Yep. So what we could do to make this even easier for users, they say generate documentation, and we put this block of text in here, and we put the first tab stop inside the summary tag. So they just start typing the summary. And then when they press tab, it goes to the first parameter, tab, second parameter, tab, third parameter, all the way to the returns. And that's not even a huge technical jump. That requires changing the return type from plain text to snippet. And then when we do that formatting, putting in a couple $sign numeric, like the first tab stop is $0, second tab stop is $1, etc. And it just, the editor takes over from there. And that's a super tiny fix or super tiny change that would be a massive like usability enhancement. So that's the kind of thing that makes me excited.
Yep, totally.
So
I mean,
yeah. So
yeah, it's the same technology that Visual Studio Code is using for if you have like snippets defined. I don't think we define any snippets in F#, but for like JavaScript or TypeScript, this is like typical part of users' workflow. So that would be great. And kind of like this whole story about how you started with tooling, that you wanted to fix some part of your workflow is kind of like resonating with me really like strongly, because that's exactly what I wanted. Like, I mean, I wanted to use this like cool editor because like Atom, like I mean, marketing for Atom was so amazing. Like this hackable editor of 21st century. That was like the headline. It's been a year since I still remember that. That was like a ridiculously cool idea. And then this idea that every single part of your editor is actually plugin, and you can modify that. You can turn off like about window in Atom was freaking plugin. So if you wanted to turn off ability of having about window in editor, you could do that if you wanted. Of course, Atom had its own problem, but let's not go there. But
I
yeah,
completely agree with that. Like 100%. That's I've done a little bit of editor tooling plugin stuff for Writer and for VS Full, and those experiences to me just drag so much in comparison to just being able to slam out some HTML for a open window in VS Code. Like the friction to actually see something seems
yep.
to be far, far, far less in VS Code. And as with like many open source endeavors, like time is the most valuable commodity. So if you can cut down on the friction to get started and to see something, you have a much better chance of actually getting to whatever
Yep.
your end goal is.
Yep, exactly. Especially that, so in comparison to Atom, Visual Studio Code has super high level APIs. So in Atom, you could do like everything on low level, which was great. At the same time, I remember that when we were displaying tooltips in Atom, it was actually custom jQuery code that was inserting divs in correct position in the view. So that was not great. That was part that was not great. So going back to my story, I wanted to use Atom with F#. And I was kind of like, okay, let's start with. So basically, first of all, I've tweeted something, and then Thomas told me you should do that, because that's how Thomas deals with
He's the
stuff.
great enabler.
Yep, totally. And of course, I've got like a lot of help from him, from Stefan at the beginning, from Alfonso answering all my stupid FunScript questions. but basically, at the beginning, like I didn't know anything about like F# tooling. I didn't know anything about F# compiler. I didn't know anything about FS Autocomplete, because FS Autocomplete was already around, and it was already then. It was like long-standing project with existing integrations with other editors, like Emacs and Vim.
Shout out to Robin Netherwary. You're
Yep.
awesome. Or sorry, Robin Munn? Robin Netherwary?
Robin Netherwary.
Yeah.
I think Robin actually works at GitHub nowadays. I need to reach out. What I was about to say. So yeah, so I started to use FS Autocomplete just as a API first. Then I've started to actually like, just like you've said, oh, I want to have this cool feature. I probably need to add some new API to this like magical black box that I've been using. Let's dive into this black box. And a couple of years later, I think I've rewritten FS Autocomplete 2 times at least.
Yeah, and like any long-lived project, that shows in some places, right? Like it used to have multiple transports, right? So the project itself is split up so that all of the actual domain logic, like everything to do with the compiler types and getting out the data to answer specific user questions, that's all in like a .core library. And then the top level libraries would be responsible for translating that into whatever transport mechanism. Like there used to be a just plain text. There's a custom HTTP or a custom STDIO or standard input output protocol that it used.
Yep. So it's actually a funny story. There used to be this like standard input output, and there was, but back when I started with the tooling, I was super unhappy with that. So I've added the HTTP protocol on top of that, because that was like super simple to use from the Atom, from the JavaScript ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's super easy to do, HTTP request and get response and do JSON stuff. And then a couple of years later, we are actually back with using LSP, which is standard input-output protocol. So we are back, like we circled back to using standard input-output with different protocol, but still same old technologies.
Mm-hmm.
So
everything old is new again.
Yeah, man. That's also for like funny thingy that some people that are not so deep into editor tooling, like, oh, there's like language servers, and the language server protocol, that was kind of like Microsoft invented that, or like blah blah. And I'm like, we had language server for like 8 years before language server protocol.
This is just JSON RPC, dang it.
Dude, yeah. It's really good JSON RPC, but well, I mean, really decently designed protocol.
Mhm.
But yeah,
The transport mechanism isn't the interesting part.
Yeah,
It's
definitely.
the protocol spec itself. Yeah. Speaking of, I have like twice now trialed completely ripping out your custom LSP protocol implementation, like the transport itself. Mostly because implementing cancellation in that was super rough.
Yeah.
Super rough. But I was doing some prototyping stuff with Florian of Phantomus. And he eventually, like, I don't know if you know, but he's got an LSP version of Phantomus now. And what that means is it's a JSON RPC binary, right?
Yeah.
That's all it is. LSP is JSON RPC with some fancy stuff on top. So he's using a slightly different library that he and I sort of were iterating on, trialing out all the different libraries that were out there at the time. And he's had some pretty good success with that.
So
the branch is super old, but like it does the typical C# thing with like reflection binding to attributed methods sort of thing.
Yeah, that sounds terrible.
But it supports cancellation.
Yeah, I mean that's good. I mean, we do have like, I mean, our LSP protocol is a reusable component. If someone would want to create their own LSP server, then they just need to drop this, like, it's single file, I believe, or maybe like 2 files or something like that.
Yeah, the core stuff is all just one file. Then there's another file full of like, here's some nice stuff on top of it you might like. So, anywho.
Actually, the background service is also a language server protocol service, and it's using LSP for communication both ways with the main process. All right, so let's go even deeper. So,
oh dear.
You've been for a while really involved into F# compiler services from like maintenance point of view, right? The publishing releases, the documentation, all that stuff. So how did this happen?
How did that happen? Well, memory's a little vague, but so there used to be a big split in the F# repositories, right? There was the what used to be Microsoft/Visual F#, and now is .NET/F#. But then there was the community distribution of F# as well, which was hosted at F#/F# on GitHub. And there was this fairly large maintenance task that happened on a periodic basis where we would basically shove commits over from one to the other. And it wasn't something as simple as, just a merge across, because the F# repo had a whole bunch of additional packaging for Mono in there. It was like a truly cross-platform repository from the get-go. It had its own build script. It had its own build process. And the result of that was an F# compiler and an F# interactive program that Mono or any of the other distributions could independently take and use. That became... I took over that task for a bit, and... sorry, I got a text. Because Don was having to do it all himself, right? And guy's already doing 80,000 other things. This is basically being a code janitor. I can do that. And so I took it on myself to keep that thing updated and to start pushing some of these updates to some of these other components as well. So like making sure the merge to F# happened after feature releases and whatnot, and letting downstream consumers like the Mono packaging and whatnot know that there was new stuff there. That was a huge pain in the butt and would often be a multi-month process because the Microsoft/Visual F# build was so tightly bound into a Windows Citrix point of view. With the shift over to .NET Core, the differences between the repos got a lot less stark. And what ended up happening was that, eventually Mono moved over to the .NET Core build of the compiler as well. And so what ended up happening was we also just had, like, we no longer needed to maintain that F# repo. What we did need as a community, though, was updates to the F# compiler service package. This was the other reason I started looking at this, because tools like FS Autocomplete and tools like Fake and whatnot needed updated F# compiler service binaries to stay up to date with new features in the language.
So
And
probably for those of like viewers who don't know, F# compiler service is a version of F# compiler that's distributed as a library with a whole bunch of additional APIs on top for like editor tooling, which basically like it's a version of the compiler designed to be used in the editor tooling or in other type of tooling too. So that's what we've been using in Ionite, in FS Autocomplete. That's what I've been using in some other projects that I have in Fortnite, for example, and so on.
Yep, it is fairly ubiquitous.
Yes.
This component, F# compiler service powers every F# editor experience you as a user use. It is directly consumed by the writer F# integration. It powers everything you see in Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code, and the fact that all of that is in that one central location has been a huge boon for each individual editor, because fixes there impact everyone. We get them all for free. So super awesome, and it's something we've been able to use and have as a sort of shared community resource for like from the beginning.
Well, let me tell you the story about how the initial version of the F# compiler service was actually using reflection to call private APIs of F# compiler. From the beginning, almost, but yes.
All right, from very early on. So
shout out
to
like Dave Thomas and Thomas Petrichek and all other people that were involved into creating that. That's like, I mean, that's another thing that probably like a lot of people don't appreciate, but it's one of the biggest values of the F# ecosystem in terms of why we can have so great tooling in comparison to other niche languages. That's literally the reason that because we have the F# compiler service. Yeah, and sorry for interrupting.
Oh no, this is all super necessary context. Like, we build upon the shoulders of those who came before. We would not be where we are without them. So yeah, that component needed to be updated, and that was a very similar sort of process to updating F#. Merge a whole bunch of stuff over, delete 2/3 of the .NET F# repo, because we only cared about the stuff that was specifically in the F# compiler service sort of dependency tree, and then package and publish that NuGet package. This was also kind of annoying for many of the same reasons. Incompatible build scripts. We published F# compiler service as one might any open source library. It was basically .NET Build and .NET Pack orchestrated with Fake and some other stuff. Doing that on a monthly or semi-weekly basis was a lot of overhead. And I felt that we needed to do it that frequently to keep editors up to date and also to be able to provide feedback as soon as possible upstream.
That was especially important for like Ionite, because we've been like usually the ones that were implementing new features or like support for the new version of the language or support for the new version of the compiler tooling first. Well, I mean, Visual Studio Code was implementing those features at the same time, but they didn't really had a mechanism for giving that to users, and we were just happy to just add new FCS package, push to thousands of users that we have, and let them complain if necessary.
Yep. Historically, VS Code has been sort of on the leading edge of some of this stuff. A little bit less so these days, and I'll get into why that is. So because I was doing these updates, they would often happen out of band with like Microsoft releases of things. So we might have, this is not a real example, but like string interpolation a month ahead of Visual Studio, right? As an example.
That actually created some funny problems where we had features in editor that were not supported by the compiler that people had installed yet. So
Correct.
so I think string interpolation was one of those examples when you could use string interpolation in editor, and we would provide all the fancy stuff with like
You're right,
autocomplete.
because that was in preview for a while,
Yes,
and we implicitly put the preview flag on for a
yes.
while there. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. That was back before we, I think, added the ability to for users to specify their own flags coming in. Okay, so yeah, that was a lot of work that I had to do periodically, and sort of in addition, it got to the point where FCS needed to be, for various reasons, tied to the version of F# core that it was consuming. It's sort of a weird circular reference here because F# core is used internally to the compiler, its data structures, its functions, and whatnot to process your code. But you also need a reference to F# core to do certain actions. So string interpolation requires a certain version of F# core. The new state machine builders will require a certain version of F# core because the compiler will emit references to functions that are assumed to be in that version of F# core, right? So this sort of coevolution of the core library and the compiler meant that FCS needed a specific F# core version, and you couldn't just build them out of band easily like that. And so after some discussion, the community decided that we would be okay pushing the publishing of FCS back into the main .NET F# repo. And that's the situation as it stands today. When a version of the compiler or tooling is stamped for release, which typically happens as part of a new build of the .NET SDK, so roughly every month or so, a new version of FCS can also be cut. In addition, for the past like 6 months plus now, we've had nightly versions of FCS built from the main branch, which has been incredibly useful. We haven't actively pushed out anything like this, but months ahead of the stable release of FCS, contributors to FS Autocomplete are able to just pull in from the pre-release feeds those changes, adjust the code base to them, push up work in progress branches, and just keep those rebased on top of the latest branches, and potentially through our test suites find differences in behaviors between the versions that may not be intended.
I strongly doubt you can find anything through our test suite, but okay.
Here's an example. I'm currently updating to FCS 40 right now, and one of our incredibly helpful contributors, his name is Buxbaum, submitted a very exhaustive suite of autocomplete open tests. So their examples were basically a whole bunch of scenarios in which they want to use the regex type from system.text.regular expressions. And their whole test suite is, given these different scenarios, assuming I invoke the quick fix here to they didn't have an open for system text regular expressions. Assuming I invoke this here, where will that insertion happen? Like, where will that text be put? Will it be put in the nearest available scope? Will it be put under the correct module? If I'm in a namespace, will that be respected? And of those like 40 tests, 32 of them pass under FCS 40, which immediately tells me, and looking deeper into some of those tests, that something about the way the FCS API we are using to determine that insertion context has changed. I personally don't believe that this API is under good enough test upstream. And so us having that level of testing coverage is a signal to me that either something has changed and that functionality hasn't been updated to go along with it, or something was wrong and there was an assumption that was incorrect in our tests overall. So I'm still actively vetting that out, but I'm like 70% sure that it's an unintended change in the compiler services themselves, which is great. It means we caught a thing, we have a chance to upstream it, right? So
Yeah, that's awesome.
Big shout out to them, to Booksbaum. The contributors we've had recently have been very, very on top of adding exhaustive test suites, and I think increasing the test coverage with scenario-based testing in FS Autocomplete overall has been a huge boon.
Yeah, and in general, like, I mean, obviously for Ionide, like you and me are probably like the most well-known people working on that right now, but historically we have a whole bunch of like various different contributors that came in for some time, did awesome job, then maybe left, maybe are busy with something else, but Ionite and FS Autocomplete wouldn't be the same without them. It's like a whole bunch of people. Like Enrico Sada was super useful, super helpful with the all the like early days of Project Info and all this stuff. Like whole bunch of other people that were doing great stuff. Like Maxim with the documentation, which means that we have like the best tooltips in the F Sharp.
Well, that was something I was going to point out. Like you and I think are fairly general in our knowledge and interest in these projects, but I think a much more common pattern for a lot of our contributors is this slice of functionality or this area is something I feel super deeply about and I want to make great, like Maxim and tooltips and XML documentation, right? He went deep on that. He went very exhaustive, and as a result, we have amazing tooltips. We have amazing hover displays all over the place, and that's great. Booksbaum, same way with the autocomplete stuff here. And then we had, I think, Happy Pig just the other day on the .NET templates, right?
Yeah.
In each case, finding a particular use case that you are interested in either fixing or caring about and making better, and making that change.
That's also like just great general tip for like doing open source. Like sometimes people ask me how to start with open source or what are the problems I should solve and what community needs. It's kind of like also a recurring question, and my answer to that.
Let me just tap into the hive mind here.
Yeah, dude. My answer to that always is just solve one of your personal problems with, like, in any space you are. Like if you're using some web library, solve the problem that you've noticed while using this web library. If you're using tooling, solve something like simple and small that you've noticed, or maybe complex. Like, I mean, sometimes problems are complex, but then just focus on those particular things that annoy you personally. Otherwise, you will just either never start, or you will run out of energy really soon, or
so what you're telling me here is you need to be a cranky old codger so that everything annoys you, so that you fix everything.
Yeah, well,
that's what I'm getting.
That's you.
Accurate.
I ain't old, so
So I mean, recently, my particular slice of this kind of get annoyed, go fix it story is over in Packet, which we use in ProjInfo for cracking MSBuild stuff, and we use in FSAC as well. So we use this library from Microsoft called MSBuild Locator, and it has some checks in its build. So like when you've consumed this project, it checks to make sure that you've set exclude assets runtime on the dependencies so that you don't include any of the DLLs in your deployed project. This is a weird, hairy implementation detail, but for some reason, Packet wasn't respecting that. And so I figured out why. I was like, this is not the case. So I had to go learn about how Packet actually includes that metadata and then trace that back into where the mismatch was and then submit a PR for it. So in the tooling that we work on and in the space that we work on, I think like 80% of my contributions are like irritation or spite driven.
Yep, totally.
So find out something that annoys you, find out something that you want to be better, and tackle it. So.
Yeah, and also just talk with the maintainers. Like maintainers usually know that those stuff exist. It's kind of like, just if something doesn't annoy me enough, I won't fix that because I have like a whole bunch of other things that annoy me enough. But if one of you, one of viewers would like to fix some issue, we would be happy to help. And that's true about like any single open source project on the planet. Like open source maintainers, like there is no other thing they love so much as getting people that want to help with project.
Yeah, I mean, Happy Pig over on the Discord, which I love that I'm saying Happy Pig on live stream. Someone over on the Discord was using Ionide and trying to start a new project with the .NET New templates, right? And it wasn't working for some reason. And Happy Pig was like, this can't be the case. Why is this the case? And started just like talking through their findings, and with a couple little comments interspersed there by me, since I was active at that time, they found out where the issue was, asked me like how to resolve it. I told them a couple pointers, and then they submitted a PR with the fix and the test in our test suite, and we merged it yesterday, right? So we, as open source maintainers, like sort of the general class, are often like super ready and willing and able to help folks like solve their problem, because their problem is also our problem. But like you said, we have all these other problems too.
Yeah. So I guess we're slowly reaching our time today. Is there one last question I have? What's the thing that excites you most about like what's incoming in the future? Like if there was one thing that you would like to work on, if you had time, or like anything like that?
There are, so one of them is more broadly applicable than the other. So the one that I'm most nerding out about is I've been working on FSLex and FSYAC, which are the parser and lexer generators that the compiler uses, as well as a few other projects, but the compiler is the biggest one I know of. The tooling experience for those files is abysmal. You get some basic syntax highlighting, maybe, because somebody made a quick regex TextMate plugin for it, but you don't get IntelliSense, you don't get any sort of in-depth knowledge about the tokens that make up that file. And importantly for the parsers, if you've ever looked at it, a parser rule looks like name of the rule and then like other sub rules that it will match upon, and then a block of F# text or F# code. You get zero syntax highlighting, help, autocomplete, anything for any of that F# code. And I hate that. Over the next year, I'm like long-term thinking, I want to get to the point where the tooling experience for those files is much better. I want to make VS Code and Ionide the best place to work on the compiler. For any number of reasons, but especially for working on the parser and lexer. And the first step of that is publishing versions of libraries that can parse those lexer and parser files, and then adding identifier range information and sort of F# compiler service-esque features into those libraries. So I'm well on the way to that. So I'm looking forward to sort of bringing that effort home. The broader, more general one is working on more seamlessly integrating Swagger generation into Giraffe, which is a giant weak point in that ecosystem right now. And even with the new minimal API template stuff that Microsoft has been working on, it's still so tightly bound to their way of doing it. So you either have to use all the attributes on a controller to generate the Swagger spec, and apologize for anyone who thinks I should be saying OpenAPI all the time, but OpenAPI's own marketing is mixed. So you either have to use controllers and all the attributes, or you have to you specifically have to use a lambda that represents a method info, like a single method info that takes a tuple of X parameters. And if you do that shape very specifically in their map get or map post or whatever structures, then you will get automatic Swagger generation, which means it doesn't work for Giraffe, it doesn't work for Falco, it doesn't work for Saturn, it doesn't work for anything that isn't specifically using these new structures that they have. So that's sort of a open area of research, how to best do that. At a high level, you want to add some metadata to the endpoint that describes its parameters and everything. And then there's a processing step that has to go turn that metadata into a Swagger spec. But like everything, the problem is in how to do that in a way that doesn't break every single giraffe application already written.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that sounds fun. I'll tell you about what I'm excited most right now. I've just got email saying that Dune TTRPG is available at Roll20, and it includes like art and tokens and like all the stuff. Just it costs like $60, but fuck that. Like
I don't care if I can jump on the dunes of Arrakis and ride a sandworm and go eat myself a spice extractor. That'll be worth it to me.
And they say that it's integrated with Compendium, which will be awesome for like playing Control 20. Like, I mean, we need to do that, man, one day.
We do.
All right. I think that's it for today. Thanks a lot, Chet, for being here. That was a pleasure to have you here.
Well, yeah, it's always a good time to chat.
Yeah, man, it's been amazing. Thanks everyone for watching, and see you there next time. Bye.